take you through this session. Before we go any further, we can bow our heads and pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for the gift of life. We're grateful for the gift of one another. Our dear Heavenly Father, as we go through this webinar, may you be with us, may you guide us, and may you take us through. And may this be a well of wisdom for your children. We pray this trusting and believing in Jesus' name. Amen. Yes. Thank you so much for tuning in. When you join, kindly drop the fire emoji. Here at Savo, we are all about financial independence, retire early, and we represent it with the fire emoji. And before we go any further, today I'm humbled to be joined by our very own lawyers. I call them my learned friends, and I can give them a second or a minute to introduce themselves, to just say their name.
Thank you, Alice, for having us tonight. Hello, everyone. My name is Kemunto Mogendi. I'm a lawyer at FMC Advocates.
Thank you, Kemunto.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lewis Donga. I'm also a lawyer at FMC Advocates, and I am so pleased to be joining Alice in this webinar. So thanks so much, Alice.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, guys, for always taking your time to come and do this with me. We do not take it for granted, and we appreciate. Here at Savo, we have one core value called partnership. Partnership is a win-win. If both of us can't win, then let's not deal, and you have been good partners. In a case where I will win and you will both win. Thank you so much. As I said, please drop in the fire emoji. Tell us where you're watching us from, so that we are able to know who has joined us tonight. And before we go any further, we have our newest project currently letting. That is Savo Skywalk on Bong Road. That is Wanye Road. Please get in touch with one of our Savorites. A number will be dropped on the comment section. Please get in touch with them, and they're able to lead you through the letting process and give you a unit, so that you come and enjoy just the lifestyle that we offer here at Savo. So our studios go for 15,500 up to the largest unit. Up to the largest unit, our one bedroom going for 30,500. So kindly come and reside with us. And when you join, drop your fire emoji. The webinar we're doing today is a follow-up or an addition to, or a build-up to what we did 2 weeks ago. I had been joined by both Kemunto and Lewis, and we did a segment on data privacy and investments. And for those who had not had the privilege of joining us last time, we will do a little bit of recap, so that you're able to understand and you're able to go through with us as we do today's segment. So I'd like for Kemunto to just give us a brief of what it was.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for highlighting that we started this conversation 2 weeks ago. And some of the issues we looked at 2 weeks ago are, first, we defined what data privacy is, and we just mentioned that it relates to how people who collect your data use it. It basically relates to safeguards that are put in place to ensure that your data is used according to the provisions of the law. We also looked at some of the rights that you enjoy as a person giving out your data, and we mentioned that first, you have a right to know where your data is being collected, and that you can access it at any time. Yes. And in case your data is not correct, you can then ask the person who collected it and who has made a mistake in recording it to rectify it. Yes. And in situations where, for example, you no longer want your data to be used, then you can approach the person who collected it. Yes. And then you ask them to delete it as of right. You have the right to do all that. Yes. The other thing that we looked at last week, which is very important, and we're going to build up on it, is the Data Protection Act itself. We stated that it's brought in so many mechanisms that are for our good as people who always give out our data, and also the benefits that people collecting the data in terms of it's a roadmap, it's a guidance to how they are supposed to engage in the data collection. And last week we highlighted that in as much as there are rights that a person giving out their data enjoys, there are also certain guidelines that they have to stick to when they are collecting that data from you. And tonight, we'll be looking at those guidelines that the Act gives, and we'll be able to give you examples in different scenarios to help us understand better what kind of guidelines should these people taking our data be following. But before we even proceed to that, I just want to give a refresher on two very important terminologies that we are using tonight, which is data processor and data controller. And we had an opportunity to highlight this in the last webinar. So a data controller is basically the person who gives instructions to another person to collect certain information about you, and they explain to that person be that I need this information for ABCD purpose. So that's who we will be calling a data controller tonight. Now, the person who has been given these instructions that please collect this data for this reason is now a data processor, the person collecting this data. So tonight we will explore the guidelines that the Act gives, and we will narrow down and talk about a very important concept in the field of data protection, which is about you agreeing to your data being collected. So we will look at what are the ways you can agree, why should you agree to it, and other things that we will see as we go on.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kemunto, for that very beautiful and it's expounding, you're really expounding what we did last time for someone who was not able to join. And after this, you can go back to our videos. A video we did 2 weeks ago, and you're just able to go through it and understand what this was about. Kemunto has said something very important, that we give out our data at very many instances. Our data is used for very many things. You want to get into a contract, people need your name. You want to sign up for something online. They ask you, do you agree to the terms? And sometimes we don't even read, but we agree. Somewhat we end up agreeing. So over to you, Lewis. So what are the guidelines of this data collection? What are we say things, when you tell people use your best judgment, it has to be within certain principles and certain boundaries. So what are these boundaries?
Thank you, Alice. So as Kemunto stated, and I believe I'll repeat perhaps his quote that happened, or that she stated last time, is that data is the new oil.
Yes.
And that there is a very, very keen importance for us to determine how your data is being used, how it's being processed, and how much we actually limit this collection or use of your data. And so these guidelines that are given under the Act are basically meant to be fulfilled by each and every single person, be it a data controller, be it a data processor. They are all required to follow these specific guidelines as given within the Data Protection Act. And these are what we call the principles of data protection. And they bind every single controller and processor. And I think the first very important one is that every processing, every collection or use or storage or any operation that you're doing on information or on data must be done in consideration of the right to privacy. So the idea of the Data Protection Act, or the purpose of it, was to enable an individual's right to privacy, which is a constitutional right, in fact. If you check Article 31 of the Constitution, it provides that each and every single person in this country has a right to privacy. It does give specific sort of provisions within that to say that you as an individual, your property, your home cannot just be searched. And it's really avoiding that sort of police state where people just show up and they want to see your information, they want to have access to it. But more importantly, and a very key provision that is within now the Constitution, is to say that a person's individual's information about their private life or their family cannot be unnecessarily accessed. So with this provision now, we find that the Data Protection Act is coming in to say that because we have given specific provision within the Constitution to say every single individual has a right to privacy, we now need to expand on this more and to say these provisions of the Data Protection Act guide any single individual and any single person who is purporting to access or to use an individual's data to ensure that they do not infringe their right to privacy. So that is the very key and the very first principle under data protection.
Can we call it the why for data protection? Basically?
Yeah, actually, I think that's actually the best way. We can call it the basis or the why. Why the Data Protection Act to enable the provisions of the right to privacy in the Constitution. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lewis. Over to you, Kemunto. Another guideline.
So the other guideline that we have, in addition to the right to privacy, as Lewis has stated, is that the person collecting your data has to be transparent with you. This basically means when you're about to give out your data, this person has to be open about certain aspects, as to why they are collecting this data. For example, if you have approached a bank to ask for a loan, and the service provider is asking for your name, for your statement of financial statements, for people who can guarantee the loan, and whether you have other loans with other banks, your credit history. As they're asking for that, they need to disclose why do we need this information. So they have to give you a valid reason as to why they need this information. Yes.
And per se, what's a valid reason? Because me, I'd want to know, for example, your health status for some reason that to me is valid. So what does the law term as a valid reason?
So health status could be valid, but to answer your question, a valid reason means something that is within the provisions of the law, the limits of the law. For example, if you're giving your data so that you can get a loan, really your health status is not directly linked to getting a loan. So the reason has to be one that is within the limits of the law. It has to be legal, for something that has been given in the law. For example, it could be maybe to complete a contract. For example, if it's for purposes of your employment, so you're giving out your information so that your contract of employment can be drafted, or so that the bank can open an account for you. There has to be a valid reason, a reason that is within the provisions of the law, basically. The other thing that in being transparent, the person collecting your data, a data controller or processor, should disclose to you the modes that they're going to use to collect your data, and also what they're going to do in terms of processing your data. In the last webinar, we had looked at the meaning of processing data, and we had said that it's anything that you do with the data. So they need to tell you how they are collecting it. They need to tell you how they are storing it. They need to inform you who has access to this data. Are there people beyond him or her that will also have a look at your information? They need to tell you how they are going to organize it, how they will manipulate it during their usage, if they intend to transfer it elsewhere. All this information needs to be disclosed to you. So transparency just means openness. Let them be very open with you, tell you everything that relates to the use of your data. Yes.
And if they the reason as to why they want my data is a tick, but when I ask to understand how they will store my data, I don't feel quote unquote safe. I don't feel like am I allowed to withdraw?
Yes, Alice, you're allowed to withdraw. So one of the things that we spoke about in the last webinar was that a data subject has a right to withdraw their authorization for collection of the data if they feel they are no longer comfortable with such collection. So at that point, as the person collecting your data is informing you that I need your data for these reasons, they also need to tell you that if it reaches a point you're not comfortable with us having this data, or the reason for which we are collecting it is already done, then you can just withdraw your authorization, which in law is called consent. You just tell them, no, I no longer want my data being used for these reasons. But you find that what the law does is there are instances when you actually can't withdraw it. For example, if we have your data for, say, performance of a contract, maybe it's an agreement for sale, you're supposed to make certain payments, you're supposed to fulfill certain duties under that agreement. You see, it will be very unreasonable for you to start saying, no, I don't want you to have my bank account details anymore, or certain details that you gave us so that we are able to fulfill these obligations that are stated in the agreement. So in as much as you have this right, it's not, it has its limits. It still has its limits, but the underlying factor is the person collecting your data needs to let you know that should you be uncomfortable, or if the reason for which it's being collected has already been fulfilled, then you can proceed and politely ask them to stop using your data.
Okay. Over to you, ladies.
So the next, and I think very important linked to the transparency issue, as Kemunto stated,
Yes.
is a valid reason, or what we call a legitimate purpose.
Yes.
So the idea is that you cannot have a data controller or a processor or anybody who is using data. They cannot hope that they can use this information for an illegal purpose or an illegal reason.
Yeah.
And the idea is that we cannot have, and we sort of, the principles in law state that at least there needs to be some form of legality. So if I give an example, perhaps you say that I want to use your information for purposes of bank fraud. I want to obtain your ID, I obtain the details on your account so that I can use your account for illegal purposes. So in as much as, yes, this is processing of information, you are actually taking, doing a specific operation on data, but this operation is illegal.
Yeah.
So if, for example, you want to say that you're using data for identity theft, this is you taking somebody, and identity theft is a situation where you basically impersonate somebody. You take their name, you take their likeness, you take all their details, and basically use them for illegal purposes without these people's consent. And this is something that usually happens a lot, especially with regards to bank fraud. People want to, make some transactions or make some illegal transactions. So every single time that a processor or a controller is using or collecting or any operation that they do on data, it has to be for a legitimate purpose. And Kemunto has given very good examples. So for example, if you want to get into a valid contract, for example, for an agreement for the sale of, let's say, an apartment, in that specific instance, we need to collect your information so that we can actually perform this agreement. We need to collect your information so that we can say, because ABCD person has entered into an agreement with ABCD person, and therefore we can now comply. We can now say that this is the person who is required to comply with part A or part B or part C of the contract. Another good example is when you collect information for KYC purposes. Most businesses will do this. They will ask you before we can even transact, before we can even engage. Oh, sorry, yes, KYC is know your customer, sorry. So for know your customer purposes, where they say that before you and I can engage, what I need to do is I need to know who I'm talking to. I need to identify you. So they'll ask you for your identification documents. They can ask you for your ID, ask you for your phone numbers, just so they can verify and say, I know who I'm dealing with, and before we can conduct any business, I am aware of who I'm dealing with. So that's an important principle, is that data must be used for a legitimate purpose. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Levi.
Yes, so closely tied to the principle of legitimate purpose is what we call necessity.
Yes.
What does this mean? In as much as you have a valid reason for taking my data, for example, assuming it was to complete an say we've already finished the whole procedure, I already have my title for this apartment, but you still insist on having my data. You see, we are saying that you are collecting this data for a valid reason.
Yes.
But at this point, the reason as to which you need my data, which is to sell an apartment to me and to give me the title, has already been done. But you still want to hold on to my data. You still want to store it. You still want to have records of it. The other principle that comes into play at this point is the principle of necessity. So at this point, the data controller or the data processor has to show that it is extremely necessary for me to continue having your data. In as much as the valid reason is already spent, I still need it for other reasons. Say, to complete my record keeping or something, but they have to give you a timeline within which they are going to have this data. So in as much as it is for a legitimate purpose, it should also be that it is very necessary for you to have this data. Another example that I can give to help us understand this is, for example, Liz, when you're making job applications or in job interviews, and you're asked, say, marital status or marital status mostly. You find that this is an issue of contention. People wonder, oh, why are you asking whether I'm married or whether I'm single, and it's a job interview. It depends with the complexity of the job, the kind of job you're applying to, plus the position. You know, sometimes you find that it's so demanding, we need to know if you have other commitments. So in such a scenario, what the interviewer as the data collector needs to understand or to ask themselves is that, is this data necessary? Is this piece of information I'm trying to collect necessary to this purpose that I am seeking to achieve? Yes.
Okay, thank you, Kemunto, for that.
Great. So I think the final principle that we'll discuss is the principle of accuracy.
Yes.
So, and we saw this very much, especially in our previous webinar, we talked about the rights of data subjects. So, under this principle of accuracy, yes, it's basically stating that any information that you have regarding a data subject, and I think last time we defined the data subject as any person with whom information is related to. So, for example, if I am a data subject and my personal data is like my name, my email, my phone number, and the like. So if you have any information relating to a data subject, this information needs to be accurate. Yeah. You cannot keep, or you cannot store, you cannot use false or misleading information. Why? Yeah. Because this actually relates to a person. Yeah. You cannot, and the sort of effect of having misleading information would be, for example, if I have your name wrong, for example, and I want to use your name to complete a particular agreement, yes, you can imagine the situation that comes up when you have a different name and yet you're trying to bind a specific person saying, yeah, I know the name is wrong, yes, but I mean person X. So, yeah, and in this instance, every single data subject actually has a right to say, yeah, that you have my name wrong, you have my mobile number wrong, you have my email address wrong, correct it and fix it. And that's what we call the right to correct false or misleading information. Yeah. To say that, please fix my name, my actual name is this, this, and this, and this, and this. Yeah. You might even find in some situations that you actually, as a data subject, you decide, I actually want you to delete this information. Just delete it. I no longer want it on your. And I think Kemunto had sort of alluded to that, saying that what's what you're doing, we are withdrawing your authorization. You're saying that I am exercising my right to delete, or what the Western countries like calling the right to be forgotten, where they say that I do not want you to have this information of me anymore, yes, just delete it. Yeah. It could be because it's inaccurate, or perhaps maybe the legitimate purpose that we have spoken for before has already been spent, yeah, but ideally you have that right. And that's what you see. The principle of accuracy is actually enabling, yeah, this right to deletion of false or misleading data, and the right to correct false or misleading data. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Before we're able to go to the next segment, we can see who's joined us tonight. And for everyone who's joined us, if you have a question or need a clarification on the things we're discussing, kindly do send in your questions. We're able and ready to answer you. So I can see in the building we have Charles Wambugu, who's saying they're eagerly waiting. We're here. Please ask your questions. I can see Victoria Mbugwa, who sent in their fire emoji. Thank you so much. I can see Mombi Ann. Hi, Ann, who's also sent in their fire emoji. Thank you so much. I can see Faith Kayesi, who's also sent in their fire emoji. Thank you so much for tuning in. I can see Diana Moirori, who's said they're tuned in and they've sent their fire emoji. Thank you so much. I can see Ezekiel Okwach, who's saying hi. Thank you so much, Ezekiel. I can see Tony Shikanga, who's saying they're also following. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I can see Collins Kinuthia, who's also sent the fire emoji. I can see Makabuto Designs, who's also said they're also following. I can see Evelyn Adeni, who's also following. Cynthia Cheruto, thank you so much for tuning in and dropping the fire emoji. I can see Ellie John Mariga, who's also said they're following. Martin Migui, who's also said they're tuning in and they've dropped their fire emoji. I can see Purity Mwinja, who's also following. I can see Winnie Bon, who's also sent in their fire emoji. I can see Tom, who's also dropped the fire emoji. I can see David Daudi, who's also said hi. Kindly do send in your questions. We're able and ready to answer. So guys, you've really insisted on why it is very important for the collection of data, and for me to agree that this data is collected and for it to be stored in the right way. So what are the guidelines of collection? So how do the data processors and data controllers go about collecting this data?
So I think one of the very key and important tenets now or ideas that the Data Protection Act is giving, yes, is what we now call the concept of consent, yes, or what we are saying authorization. Yes. So the big and important question, especially with data privacy, is to ask, what is consent? Yes. And generally consent is basically just saying yes. Yeah? It's agreeing. It's agreeing. It's basically just agreeing. Okay. It's basically just saying whatever it is that I agree, that I am okay with ABCD and I agree. But and of course,
it's hard to know. Decisions are hard to make. Many people are indecisive. So how do I make sure that Kemunto here has agreed? It's not I am thinking at least you can collect. I am thinking today she thinks I can take her data. Tomorrow she's like, but what will you use it for? Just don't take it. So how do you confirm?
So
that really it's a yes.
That it's a yes.
Yes.
So we do have two ways. You can actually do it written. For example, you can sign, let's say, a consent form,
Yes.
or you can tick in a box and say that this is how I want to give my consent.
Yeah.
Or you can actually just say orally and say, yes, I agree to you using my information in this particular way. But of course, we or maybe would prefer that we put it in writing so that there is no a lot of sort of a he said, she said situation.
Yes.
Is that if your consent is in writing and it could be as simple as ticking a box and saying I agree. And I think most of us who have done the simple act of even downloading an app
Yes.
can say that there is an entire list of terms and conditions there, and then there's a checkbox for you to say I agree with the privacy policy and agree with the terms and conditions,
Yes.
and then you proceed.
Okay.
So that's really how you give that consent.
Okay.
You can even sort of record yourself and say that this is my recording of giving my consent, either through an audio or through a video.
Yes.
That can be how you give your consent. So yeah.
What do I, at this point, what do I require of the data controller and processor to be able to allow me to even give this consent? What do they need to explain to me, or what position do they need to get me to, so that it's really a yes for me and it's not, I think so, I don't think so today. Yeah, over to you, Kemunto.
So at least we started by saying that what the Data Protection Act has done is it has given people giving out their data certain rights,
Yes.
but it has also placed certain duties on people collecting data.
Yes.
So your question is one of the scenarios where the data collector has a duty.
Yes,
So in as much as they're trying to get your authorization to collect your data, there are certain things that they need to tell you. There are certain things that are in line with the principle of transparency that we had spoken about.
Yes.
The first thing that the data controller needs to tell you is, one, their identity as a data controller or a data processor.
Yes.
For example, if it's a company,
Yes.
they need to tell you that they are a registered company, a lawful entity, a legal entity, that they have capacity to collect this data. It's within their authorization. Remember, when we had our discussion 2 weeks ago, we spoke about the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner.
Yes.
And one of the roles that we highlighted is that an entity or a person who collects your data must register with the office, and at the point at which they have completed their registration, they'll be given a compliance certificate, a registration certificate that is valid for 2 years. So that certificate is one of the things that they should probably show you as proof that they are authorized to be collecting this data. So the first thing is that they need to confirm their identity as a data collector. The other thing that they need to tell you is the purpose for which they are collecting your data. And I think we cannot emphasize this enough. They need to be very, very transparent that this is the reason why we are collecting your data.
Yes.
It's a lawful reason. If anything, they can give you the legal basis for it if the scenario fits. You know. They need to tell you the purpose for which they are collecting it. But closely tied to the purpose is the processing.
Okay.
Again, I'll repeat, processing is anything they will do with the data.
Yes.
So they'll tell you the use of the data, how they'll store it, how they'll manipulate it. All these things they need to disclose before you give your consent.
Yes.
And once I finish explaining the things they need to tell you, I'll explain why it's important for them to do that. The other thing they need to tell you is the types of personal data that they are collecting.
Yes.
Again, in our last webinar, when we were trying to understand the meaning of data, we said that there are several categories of personal data.
Yes.
There is personal data, which is the general information that relates to you as a person, and there is a special category called sensitive personal data that includes your race, your social origin, such things. There's a special category of data which you can revisit our previous video and just feel your understanding on sensitive personal data.
Yes.
So they need to disclose the type of data that they are collecting.
Yes.
Another thing that we should note about the type of data is that even during registration as a data processor or as a data controller, in that registration website that we talked about in the previous webinar, you must disclose to the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner that I'm collecting this type of data.
Yeah.
Say it's employee data and it's their name, their KRA PIN, their ID number. You have to disclose the type of data that you're collecting. The other thing is that you need to tell the data subject what are the dangers of their data. You know, what are the risks that their data will be exposed to. For example, it could be unauthorized access or leakage. You know, sometimes maybe you are storing the data in a computer or whichever way you are storing the data, it could be subject to access by people who ideally should not be accessing it, or hackers. And these are some of the things we spoke about last 2 weeks ago. So they need to tell you what risks are tied to you giving out your data. And as they do that, they should be able to explain that in as much as there is this risk, our organization or as a person have taken certain steps to try and minimize these risks. If possible, they can walk you through those steps. If it's something they have done, say documentation, they can give you such documents for you to have a look. Look at the clauses they have put in place to just try and guarantee your safety, your data safety and your data privacy. The other thing that they need to very much explain to you is who has access to your data. Remember, we note that one of the risks that your data is susceptible to is unauthorized access. So it's very important for them to tell you that in giving us this data, the finance department will access it, the HR department, the people who will have access to your data should be defined. And if they intend to transfer it to, say, their branch or another entity, maybe if it's KRA or any other body, then they need to also disclose that. So the importance of them doing this, telling you all these factors that I've listed, is to ensure that when you're giving your consent, you're coming from a point of knowledge. You're giving your consent when you're fully aware of what you're getting into, the consequences of giving out this data, so that at the end of the day, we can say that you gave informed consent. And it's informed consent because you understood the details of the entire exercise.
Okay. Other than so, what should the data processor look out for? Because I can give out my data, I can have understood, but tomorrow I decide that I have not understood. So what are the key, quote unquote, red flags or things that they need to ascertain so that they know, as I collected this data, it is rightful and it is lawful for me to be in possession of this kind of data?
So as a data controller or as a data processor, you need to make sure that this person is able to give you that consent. This person has capacity to give you authorization to proceed and collect their data. What this means is in two ways. That one, they are of age to give you this data. In Kenya, you are only recognized as an adult when you are 18, regardless of how the dynamics of society have changed recently, and there is so much information available to children. They are only recognized as adults when they are 18 years old. So you are deemed to have capacity to give out your data or capacity to consent if you are 18 years. But if you're still a child that is below 18 years, then it's either your parents or guardian who will give that authorization on your behalf. The other thing that the data controller needs to look out for when it comes to capacity to consent is the status of your mental health, or rather your brain, basically. You have to be in stable mental condition so that you fully understand why you're giving your data, the consequences of giving out your data. As they're taking you through all these procedures that we have discussed, you have the ability to understand them. You know, sometimes maybe you find you're suffering from a certain illness that maybe has impaired your judgment and your ability to understand issues. So in such a scenario, you're not really fully aware of what's going on around you, and in the eyes of the law, you don't have capacity to give authorization that, yes, proceed and give them my bank account details or whatever they need. So you, as a data controller, you must ascertain that, yes, they are of age and their mental condition is perfect.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. Over to you, Lewis. We've really spoken about how consent is really like the backbone of data privacy, that you really need to give consent. This consent may be in writing, maybe a video, maybe in ticking a box and agreeing. Are there instances where consent is not needed, where me as a data controller or processor just need to have this data, and I really, quote unquote, do not need for you to consent for me to have it?
There are instances actually,
Yes,
but I
yes.
think perhaps before we actually go to those
Yes.
sort of exceptions,
Yes.
there are actually two more very specific things that a data processor needs to ensure,
Okay.
to ensure that actually this consent has been properly given.
Okay.
And I'll highlight one, and Kemunto will just take up the other one.
Yes.
So the one very important one is about this consent needs to be given out voluntarily.
Yes.
To say that let me say as Lewis,
Yes.
I have said that you've given me all this information, you've informed me on who you are as a data processor or a controller.
Yes.
You've told me that you want to process my information so that you can open
Yes.
a bank account for me. You've told me that this information will be given out perhaps to the HR department of the bank or whatever department of this bank,
Yes.
or they will send out to their maybe main company in another country.
Yes.
So having been informed all of this, I sit down and I say, okay, I have understood all of this and I voluntarily give this information to say that I am not being influenced by external forces. A very good example is if, for example, I come, for example, to you, and for example, I hold a knife to you and I tell you,
Yeah.
give me your bank account details.
Yes.
I cannot then come again and say, she consented to
Yeah.
giving me she consented, said it's okay, here you
Yeah,
go.
the details.
But there are some external forces that are influencing your decision, which shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
It can be something as extreme as that. Let's say, for example, that there's actual physical force that's being, there's a threat,
inflicted,
there's a threat of force being given against you.
Yeah.
But there's also, it can be something as simple or as subtle as, if you do not give me this information, I cannot give you this service.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
So then you get into a place where it's normally very vague, very hidden,
Yes.
but then it's like, so clearly I cannot voluntarily give you my consent, because if I don't give you the consent, therefore I cannot access the service. And it's normally a discussion that's really hard with regards to whether that is voluntary. If you give your consent to access a certain service, that if you fail to give your consent you would otherwise not access, is that voluntary? But ideally the main purpose or the main idea is that you should not be influenced by external forces. For example, you shouldn't say that perhaps maybe you as a spouse, perhaps your spouse approaches you and says, I need you to be my guarantor for me to get a loan from a bank.
Yes.
And then because it is your husband, and now you really can't say no.
Yeah,
but
you disagree.
really internally you feel like we don't need the loan. Like we are fine. I don't think we need the loan. But because you feel it's okay, it's fine, so you simply just say, okay, that's fine. You're being, and it's very subtle. It's not that clear, but there is that element of it's not really voluntary. It's not really what you want. But you have certain external forces that are,
coerced into
basically they're coercing you into saying,
Yes.
this is what you need to consent to. And if you give consent under such circumstances, then that consent is actually found to be invalid. And any use or collection or storage of information that has been obtained through consent like that, then cannot be seen to be valid processing. So that's one of the issues that a processor needs to be clear. And I think Kemunto can take up the other one. Yeah.
Okay, Kemunto.
So the last thing that you need to look out for as a data controller or processor is that you must ensure this person giving out the data is consenting only for that purpose that you're collecting it for. And I think this basically ties to the whole conversation we are having.
Yes.
It has to be for a specific purpose. It has to be held for a specific duration of time. So just be sure to confirm that they are only agreeing to collection for this specific purpose.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a question. Charles Mbugwa is saying, please readdress. Should I take, what redress should I take when it comes to my knowledge that the information I provide for contractual purposes is being misused? Yes.
So thank you for that question, Charles. So that basically means there has been a violation of your data privacy.
Yes.
And in the last segment, we spoke about the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, which is abbreviated as the ODPC. So there are certain mechanisms that this office has come up with to ensure that as a person whose data privacy is breached, you can bring a claim against the person misusing your data. So you can file a complaint against them. So you can file it either directly to the office, to the ODPC, or you can go to court. So if it comes to your knowledge, you can do that. But it's generally advised that before you proceed to such mechanisms, you can try and first have negotiations with the entity, try and see if you can find a solution out of courts, have an alternative remedy if they can stop doing that and pay you for the loss you've suffered, or whatever remedy they can give you to your liking before you proceed to court. However, the ODPC allows you to file a complaint if you feel your data is being breached or you have a violation. But the other thing that you must look out for as a person giving out your data, Charles, you must make sure that the documentation you are entering into for that purpose has safeguards that outline what will happen if there is a breach of this data. For example, if it's an agreement for sale, look out for how that agreement has been structured. Is there a clause on data protection? Is there a clause that mandates the person collecting your data to follow the guidelines that we are speaking about? Just for your own protection, for your own assurance, make sure they have put those mechanisms in writing. And also make sure you ask, before you give your consent, make sure you ask, so what are you doing to protect me? What are you doing to protect my information? But in as much as you may have such mechanisms, if they go ahead and still breach it, you can file a complaint with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner.
Thank you so much, Kemunto. Charles, I hope that is now clearly elaborated. I can see Faith Linda, who's also following keenly. Thank you so much, Faith. I can see Simon Mogendi, who's also keenly following. Thank you so much for tuning in. I can see Kelvin Masharia, who's dropped the fire emoji. I can see Bwana Senior, who's saying they're following. Roslyn Musila is also following. Sarah Moy is also following. Sunny and Son channel is also following. Kindly do drop in your questions if you have any. We are ready and able to elaborate. So over to you, Lewis.
Okay, so we'll just go back to the question you had earlier asked on consent. And you would imagine a situation that there are particular scenarios where you would not be in a position to obtain consent.
That's true.
And let's use an example of a patient who's been in an accident and now he has been wheeled into the hospital. And now you need to collect specific information about this patient. There is no family, there is nobody who is there, it's just the patient. So in that situation, would the doctors or the nurses or the officials at the hospital, would they be barred, for example, or would they be prevented by the Data Protection Act to collect this information? So the Data Protection Act has actually considered this and said that there are specific instances where we do not expressly require that you give consent, in that with these specific circumstances or situations, consent is not necessary. And I think I'll start off with the first one. And the first one is actually if the processing or the collection or the use is necessary to perform a contract. So you would imagine a situation, let me give an example with an employment contract. So you have actually gotten your employee, you've come in and you want to now draft the employment contract. So you see, in this situation, you need to create that sort of relationship with the employee. And this needs to be created through a contract. But you cannot be expected, for example, to ask the employee, please give me your name, your ID, your email address, phone number, NHIF number, NSSF number, all these important details, and then the employee refuses. So you have a situation where you as an employer, you're required by law, for example, to always give out deductions for NHIF and NSSF. That's a requirement in law. Yet, this employee has refused to give you the NHIF and NSSF numbers because they have withdrawn. They have not consenting. They are saying that I do not want to give you this information. So you see, if it's necessary for you to perform a contract, be it an employment contract, be it a usual agreement for whether it's a transfer of land or anything else, if I need to perform this contract, I do not need to ask you for your consent. This is what we can actually call a legitimate purpose, like we had explained in the principles before, to say that my performance or the obligation that has been placed upon me under this contract requires me to have your information. So if, for example, another one, a good one is maybe an insurance. So you find maybe in insurance that there are specific health information or health status that you need to collect so that you can actually disburse or maybe send out these payments to assist a patient.
Yeah.
So in this instance, you have a policy that you need to comply with, yeah? And you would not be expected that I need to go to the patient every time and ask, can I send, please, this financial information, can I be sending? So if I need to perform a contract, I am well within the provisions of the Act to say I do not actually need to get your consent. Yeah. I think maybe Kemunto can take up the next one.
Is there the instance where a person collecting your data would go ahead and do it without your authorization, is where they are required to fulfill a legal duty. Again, we had stated that there are certain duties that the Act gives on data controllers and processors, but even beyond that, as an entity or as a person in business or in whatever capacity you hold, sometimes there are duties placed on you legally. For example, when there was the rise in wash, when it became a very heated discussion, we saw that there were very robust laws that came to be created to try and address the issue on wash, which we term anti-money laundering laws. So certain entities were listed as reporting institutions. So they're expected to, in case there is unusual transaction, say if it's the bank, if they notice an unusual transaction in your account that is beyond your financial muscle, then they need to inquire such that certain transactions must be approved by the bank before you can make it, to try and curb the wash scenario. In such instances, when they are required, when they ask you to give them some of your information or some of your data, whether or not you consent, they just have to have it. They have to have it so that they are able to fulfill their legal duties on that front. Another example would be, say, Savo, you deal with sale of apartments, and before you can engage with a potential buyer, you require their ID, you require their KRA PIN. If it's a company, you require their certificate of incorporation, their tax compliance certificate, just for your customer requirements. In such a scenario, it would qualify. Whether or not they consent to it, you have to know your customer, you have to fulfill that obligation. So in such circumstances, consent becomes, it will be put aside. It will be put aside so that this purpose is fulfilled. Yes, and maybe Lewis can talk to us about other scenarios where we see public bodies or governmental authorities extending their mandate beyond your consent to fulfill particular obligations. I'll start with one example. During an application for your ID or driving license, they don't ask you, do you agree to us taking your name? Or no, they don't ask you that. They just give us your name. You need the identification card. Perhaps you can give another example if you have any to beef up that requirement by governmental authorities.
Yeah, thanks, Kemunto. So ideally, and it's important to note that the Data Protection Act does not just apply to private entities. For example, last week we talked about the registration of data processors and controllers with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner. This is not just for private bodies. You'll find that there are government institutions that are also required to register and say that we also collect information, so we need to be registered. So in this instance and in this case, the provisions of the Act still apply to government bodies. And which is why you'll see, for example, in instances where a body is undertaking official authority, for example, just like the example Kemunto has given, or if, for example, you want to get a KRA PIN certificate, you want to obtain a driver's license, in that instance, it's give us your information, we give you this. If you refuse to give us the information, then we will not serve you. So any body, any public body that's actually giving you, that's meant to comply or complying with its functions, in any situation where they need you to give them this information, they actually don't really need to ask for your consent. There's no part where you'll be told to tick here that you have consented to us obtaining your details and your information. So they're actually a very long list of exceptions. We've just really handpicked the ones that are very clear, very obvious, and usually we've seen are coming up more. There are some sort of minute ones, like, for example, in the event of research, if you need to conduct particular research, scientific research or historical research, research. In that instance, you're also not required to obtain consent. Yes. It's actually a very long list under the Act, yes. But we've just picked the 3 that we feel are very clear, and they usually come out very, very often. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lewis, for that clarification. Charles Ombogo is satisfied, and they really commend you for the answer that you've given them. Thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in and joined us today. I hope this was really helpful, and it's a guideline towards any data that you give out. You're able to know, how am I protected? How is my data protected in an event that a data processor has collected it, and I don't know. I really don't know what it is being used for. I hope now you know you need to question. You need to understand why it is being collected, how it is going to be stored, is it going to be transferred to any other entity and any other person in this matter. And before we wind up, just a moment for both of you, just let us know who you are, what do you do, and where our viewers can find you.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you, Alice,
yes.
For that beautiful summary of the discussion we've had tonight. Yes. My name is Kemunto Mogendi. I'm a lawyer at FMC Advocates. I mostly deal with employment matters, data protection matters, and tax. So if you require assistance in any of those areas, you can reach out to us. Yes.
Thank you so much, Kemunto. Over to you, Lewis.
Thank you so much, Alice, for the time and having us here and hosting us here. Yes. So again, my name is Lewis Donga, also a lawyer at FMC Advocates. We are a firm that mainly deals with commercial issues, conveyancing, and real estate issues. I personally also deal with data privacy and general tech law. And you can find us at Carlson Towers, at the 2nd floor in the left wing. It's just at the crescent of Parklands Road. It's in Westlands. Thank you so much, and we look forward to more opportunities like this, Alice. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being able to do this with us. We do not take it for granted. We are very appreciative of your time, of your sacrifice of time, of time, and always being available at call. Thank you so much. We will do this again. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us tonight, and I hope this was helpful for all of us. See you next time. Bye.
Owning your first apartment in Nairobi has never been easier. It's simple. With 0 deposit and 0% interest rate, you can pay as little as 30,000 per month for up to 5 years. Just divide the price by the number of months you want to pay. Visit www.savo.ke to learn more. Owning your first apartment in Nairobi has never been easier. It's simple. With zero deposit and 0% interest rate, you can pay as little as 30,000 per month for up to 5 years. Just divide the price by the number of months you want to pay. Visit www.savo.ke to learn more.